Their funerals had already been held. Their families had already wept, already mourned, already said their final goodbyes, and already begun to live with the grief of losing them forever. Nobody was still looking. Nobody believed there was anything left to find. And yet, on a remote volcanic island in the South Pacific, 6 teenage boys were very much alive, having built something out of nothing, having held each other together through storms that would have broken most grown men, having kept a single fire burning continuously for over a year because they understood, without anyone telling them, that the fire was the difference between rescue and disappearing from the world entirely. This is not a story about tragedy. It is a story about what human beings are truly capable of when there is no other option left. It began in June 1965 on the island of Tonga Tapu in the Kingdom of Tonga, where 6 boys between the ages of 13 and 19 were enrolled at St. Andrew's Anglican boarding school. By every account, they were bored, restless, and hungry for something their structured school life could not give them. They wanted adventure. They wanted to feel something real. So they made a plan that was reckless by any measure, slipping away from school in the dark, stealing a small 24-foot wooden boat they found at the shore, and setting out across open ocean toward Fiji, which lay roughly 500 miles away. They had no engine. They had no proper navigation equipment. They had barely any food. What they had was the unshakable confidence that only the very young possess, that certainty that things will somehow work out simply because they have not yet learned enough about the world to believe otherwise. The ocean had other plans. A fierce storm swept across their path within days of departure, snapping the rudder clean off, tearing apart their sail, and leaving them completely at the mercy of current and wind. For 8 days the boys drifted with no ability to steer, no way to call for help, and rapidly diminishing food and fresh water. When land finally appeared on the horizon, it was not the lush Fijian coast they had imagined. It was the steep volcanic cliffs of an island called Atta, a place that had been completely uninhabited since the 1860s, when the entire population had been forcibly taken away by slave traders, leaving behind only ruins, wild animals, and silence. The boys scrambled ashore, pulled what they could from the wrecked boat, and stood on a remote island that the rest of the world had effectively forgotten existed. The first weeks were the most dangerous. They were weak from dehydration, shaken by the crossing, and staring up at an island of near-vertical cliff faces covered in thick vegetation. There was no obvious source of fresh water at the shoreline. There was no flat land to make a camp. There was no welcoming landscape of coconut palms and sandy beaches that people tend to picture when they imagine a Pacific island. What the boys had found was a wild, difficult, unforgiving piece of land that required serious physical effort just to explore, let alone inhabit. The decision they made in those early days, to climb rather than stay at the shore, turned out to be the decision that saved their lives. After a grueling 2-day climb through dense vegetation and near-vertical terrain, the boys reached the island's volcanic crater and found something that changed everything. Tucked inside the ruins of the old Tongan settlement of Colomale were the remnants of a world that had once sustained human life, a clay cooking pot, a machete, and scattered evidence of gardens long returned to wild. There were feral chickens roaming the plateau. There was wild taro growing in untended patches. There were banana plants heavy with fruit. The boys had found not just food, but the bones of a functioning community, and they had the instinct and intelligence to rebuild from it. They divided their labor deliberately, assigning pairs to tend the garden, manage the cooking, and keep watch, a structure that gave their days purpose and kept despair from filling the hours that had nothing to fill them. The fire that one of the boys started using 2 sticks became the single most important object in their daily lives. Once lit, they agreed as a group that it must never go out. They took turns through the night maintaining it, treating it with the kind of devotion that people in comfortable modern lives reserve for very little. Fresh water was collected in hollowed-out tree trunks that caught the rainfall, and on the nights when rain did not come, they did what necessity demanded and drank the blood of seabirds. They caught fish from the cliffs and consumed them raw. They ate whatever the island provided and found ways to preserve what they could. Slowly, across weeks and then months, their situation transformed from desperate survival into something that began to resemble a functioning community, stripped of every luxury but organized, disciplined, and alive. There were injuries, as there inevitably are when people live with no medical care in a physically demanding environment. One boy fell from a cliff and broke his leg. The others set the bone themselves and kept him as still and comfortable as the situation allowed while it healed. There was no panic recorded. There was no abandonment. They did not turn on each other. This is perhaps the most remarkable dimension of their story, because it runs directly against the grain of everything Western culture had come to believe about what happens when young people are left without adult authority in an isolated and dangerous place. In 1954, William Golding had published Lord of the Flies, a novel that became required reading in schools across the world, built on the premise that without structure and civilization, children would descend into cruelty and chaos. The boys of Atta were living a direct refutation of that premise, and doing it in real time. They even tried to build a boat of their own, lashing together a raft with the resources the island provided, hoping to sail themselves to safety. The raft made it roughly a mile offshore before the sea broke it apart and they were forced to swim back to the cliffs. They did not try again. They understood something in that moment that only experience at sea can teach, that the Pacific does not negotiate, and that their survival depended on staying where they were and keeping that fire burning until someone, eventually, might look up and see the smoke. On the morning of September 11, 1966, 15 months and several days after the boys had first staggered ashore, an Australian fishing boat called the Just David was sailing near the island of Atta on its way back to Tasmania. The captain, a man named Peter Warner, noticed something unusual through his binoculars. The cliffs showed dark patches of burned vegetation, which could only have been made by human hands. Warner, who had spent enough time at sea to know what an uninhabited island looked like from a distance, knew that what he was seeing was not natural. He brought the boat closer. Then a figure appeared at the top of the cliffs, and then another, until 6 young men were leaping from the rocks and swimming hard toward the boat with the energy of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment for over a year. The first boy to reach the boat pulled himself aboard and spoke immediately in English, explaining who they were, where they had come from, and how long they had been on the island. Warner radioed Nuku'alofa, the Tongan capital, and read out 6 names. The response that came back across the radio silence of the Pacific is one of the most moving sentences in the entire history of maritime rescue. The voice on the other end said, "You found them. These boys have been given up for dead. Funerals have been held. If it is them, this is a miracle." And it was, by any reasonable definition of the word. 6 teenagers who had been written out of the living world had written themselves back into it through 15 months of cooperation, discipline, and an unwillingness to stop fighting for their own survival. Peter Warner, the man who found them, was so moved by their story that he became deeply connected to their lives beyond the rescue. He helped arrange for the boys to return to Tonga, covered their legal situation regarding the stolen boat by paying the owner for it out of his own pocket, and maintained relationships with several of them for decades afterward. One of the boys, a young man called Stephen who had managed to start the original fire with 2 sticks and who kept it burning across an entire year, went on to become an engineer. Another, Mano, became a community figure who decades later returned to the island with a Spanish explorer to spend 10 days living exactly as they had in 1965, surviving on fish, coconuts, and seabirds, proving that what they had done as teenagers was not a fluke of desperate luck but a genuine demonstration of human capacity. The island of Atta today remains uninhabited. Its cliffs rise from the ocean the same way they always have, steep and unwelcoming and surrounded by the kind of open water that makes a person feel very small. But somewhere on its volcanic plateau, there is a place where 6 boys kept a fire burning for over a year, tended a garden, set a broken bone, composed songs on a homemade guitar, and chose every single day to take care of each other rather than fall apart. The ruins of Cozumel are still there. The hollowed-out tree trunks that once caught rainwater are still there. And the story of what happened on that island is still there too, outlasting every doubt, every dismissal, every assumption about what people do when the world stops watching. The psychological dimension of what those boys endured is something that researchers who study human isolation have found deeply instructive. Prolonged isolation is considered by mental health professionals to be one of the most damaging experiences a person can go through, associated with deterioration of cognitive function, severe depression, and a breakdown in the ability to maintain relationships and basic self-care. Studies conducted on individuals in solitary confinement, polar researchers spending winter in Antarctic stations, and astronauts on long-duration space missions all point to the same conclusion, that the human mind requires connection, purpose, and structure to remain functional under extreme stress. The boys of Atta had all three, because they built them deliberately, and that fact alone sets their story apart from nearly every other survival account in recorded history. The relationship between their survival and their decision to maintain a communal structure has been examined seriously in the years since their story was rediscovered by a wider audience. Historian and journalist Rutger Bregman brought their account to global attention in his 2020 book Humankind, A Hopeful History, using it as one of the central arguments in his thesis that human beings are fundamentally cooperative rather than fundamentally selfish. Bregman tracked down the surviving members of the group and conducted new interviews, finding men in their 60s and 70s who remembered every detail of their time on Atta with a clarity and an absence of bitterness that is itself remarkable. They did not describe their 15 months as a trauma to be recovered from. They described it as the defining experience of their lives, the time they discovered exactly who they were. What makes their story particularly powerful for modern audiences is how completely it dismantles the myth that civilization is what separates human beings from chaos. The boys had no civilization in any formal sense on that island. They had no authority figure, no legal system, no institutional structure, no access to the tools and comforts that supposedly keep people from turning against each other. What they had was each other, and the choice, made fresh every single morning, to honor that. They assigned duties. They resolved arguments, and there were arguments, without violence. They cared for the boy with the broken leg the same way they would have wanted to be cared for themselves. They built a community not because anyone told them to but because, at the most fundamental level, that is what human beings do. It is what we have always done. The story of the 6 boys of Atta is also a story about what gets forgotten and why, and about the power of a single unexpected encounter to pull something back from obscurity. For over 50 years, their experience was largely unknown outside of Tonga and a small circle of maritime historians. It took the instincts of one attentive boat captain to notice a patch of burned grass on a distant cliff, and it took the curiosity of one historian with access to Old Pacific Island's monthly magazine archives to give that story back to the world. The ocean is full of stories like this, accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in circumstances that most of us will never face. Stories that sit in quiet corners of the historical record waiting for someone to look. The fire on Atta burned for 15 months and then it was seen. That is all it takes. One person paying attention at the right moment, and the whole world gets to know what 6 teenagers from Tonga already knew about themselves all along.